It's been well over a year now since the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass has come to a close. So much great content was added in this DLC, such as a ton of fan favorite tracks, a custom item toggle, and Peachette. But one part of the DLC that definitely stood out were all of the city tracks that came from Mario Kart Tour, but let's just say, not in a good way. Out of the 48 tracks added in this DLC, 14 of them were these city tracks, meaning they made up just under a third of the entire selection. These tracks are all based on real-world cities, which of course fits with the tour theme of the game they came from. However, with each new wave that came out, I found myself gradually getting more and more annoyed with them. I am personally not a fan of most of the city tracks in this game, and I want to take a video to thoroughly explain why that's the case. Welcome to another episode of Level by Level. As I continue my journey to avoid talking about the Bowser's Castle tracks, we're going to go through each of these cities chronologically to determine which are the best and which are the absolute bottom of the barrel. Now some of you may be thinking, haven't I already covered all of these in my Booster Course Pass series? Well, yes, you would be correct. However, I think it's important to revisit these tracks now that they've been here for a while because a lot of their problems have to do with the fact that they are all so similar to one another. Having this year to reflect on them has definitely changed my personal ranking order of these tracks and overall soured my opinions on them. So if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right into the first track. First up on our list is Paris Promenade, which is also the first track of the entire DLC. Since this was the first city track, I was overall pretty positive on it in my first video. Little did I know how much was coming. Before we get into the track, as we move through this video, I'll be throwing each of these into a tier list. Now keep in mind that this tier list is just comparing the city tracks to themselves, so an S tier here doesn't mean I think it's an S tier track with every course considered. Not that there's going to be a lot in S tier anyway. But how does Paris kick us off here? Well, first we've got to talk about the aesthetic. Yep, that's a city. Alright, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. Visually, these tracks can be very similar to one another, which is a big reason the city tracks feel so bland. Obviously there are some differences to go with the different cultures, but at the end of the day, most of them don't feel different enough. The themes behind Mario Kart tracks are often what make them so memorable. Stuff like Waluigi Pinball is so popular because of how distinct its theming is. So while Paris looked fairly distinct when it was released, now with 14 total tour cities, it's not the most different. It is nice to see the Eiffel Tower though. But how is the gameplay of this track? Well, kicking off the race, we are immediately faced with a shortcut that we can't take without an item. While you can break the piranha plant cutouts by running into them, it also causes you to spin out. Not to mention the fact that this is off-road here. So this is definitely a lap 2 cut, but I do like its inclusion. After turning around the cut, we then have to take one long turn to a glider ramp. This is another problem we're going to be seeing with a lot of the cities coming up, big empty roads. Obviously the track has to somewhat stick to the real world layout, but that often leads to portions of the track just feeling pointless. This is certainly a less extreme example than some of the stuff we have coming up, but one that I thought was worth the mention regardless. Flying off the glider ramp is a good inclusion by itself, but it also brings us to my favorite part of the track. Here you are faced with the choice to go straight under the Eiffel Tower to get an item, or you could take a sharp left, which makes you miss the item, but the route here is much quicker. I think that's a very interesting choice to make, but I usually decide to go the faster route. At the end of it, you have to go through this mini pipe field back into the main road. But don't be fooled. This is a DOF road. I don't know why they made it look like it would slow you down, but you can go over it perfectly fine without a mushroom. Cool. After that, you have to avoid a piranha plant to make a few more turns toward the finish line. Compared to the other cities, this one is very short, but we're not done just yet. While lap 2 plays out the same as the first lap, lap 3 actually has us go a completely different way from the starting line. These giant red arrows appear on every single tour track, and they'll change each lap, which was Nintendo's way of including multiple variations of the same track from tour, which I think was really creative. In the case of Paris here, it's the simplest change, having us just go through the entire thing backwards. I honestly think that works really well, especially with the ending, as that shortcut I mentioned before now comes right before the finish line, which often leads to last second passes. So overall, I still think this was a solid introduction to the city tracks. While it's certainly on the basic side, especially with it only changing on lap 3, I think that works since it was the first. Plus the fact that this is so short and simple makes the track feel fairly memorable to me. So this might be a bit controversial, but I'm actually going to be placing it up in A tier. It's a track I don't mind playing on every now and then. Oh, and to end off each segment, I'll go ahead and mention the music here too. It's alright. For our second track of Wave 1, we got Tokyo Blur. I am not going to be as positive about this one. Pretty much everyone agrees that this is the absolute bottom of the city barrel. In fact, I wouldn't blame anyone for saying this is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's worst track. Why is that? It's so boring. There's pretty much nothing unique about this to make it stand out among the other cities. I mean, we could see that just by starting off, as the first 20 seconds of lap 1 are nothing but an enclosed road. There's not even any off-road to go through. It is purely road for an incredibly long stretch of time. I mean, even some of my other least favorite tracks at least have some off-road cuts going for them. Oh, but don't worry, Tokyo Blur does get that too. There is one little corner after the first 20 seconds with a ramp. Whoa! And then we're back on the road. Yeah, lap 1 is absolutely abysmal, but maybe the other two are much better. Well, now after the first turn we have to go right instead of left, which has us driving under 2 whole thwomps. Can you believe it? Obstacles! Then the rest of it is just lap 1 again. Alright, but lap 3's got some crazy changes. Not only do we have to go through those thwomps again, but we also have to go through 2 more thwomps. But we lose the off-road cut this lap, we can't have it be too exciting. After several more seconds on completely empty bits of road, we take a glider ramp to the end. Yeah, Tokyo Blur is an atrocious map. There is barely anything interesting here. At least Paris had a few shortcuts and that interesting choice to make right after the glider. Here, there's genuinely nothing to like. I don't see anyone disagreeing with me that Tokyo Blur sits squarely in F tier. Song is also just okay like in Paris. Alright, time for wave 2, which kicked us off with New York Minute. Now right away, yes, if this was a New Donk City track, this would be S+ tier, no contest, Super Mario Odyssey the GOAT. But no, instead Nintendo had to be lame and pick a real world place. Aesthetically, I do like that this takes place at night, but this is far from the only Mario Kart City track to do that. Even looking outside of the tour selection, Moonview Highway does this much better. But what about New York's gameplay? Well, right away I can already say it's much better than Tokyo because it doesn't take a whole 20 seconds to get something interesting. After driving on the road for a bit, we get to break away into a park area, which is a good job varying up the aesthetic. Not only is there some off-road to cut through to make this turn faster, but there's also a In fact, there's actually 2 of them, which make the track more interesting as they move around. Following those guys, we get to then go under a bridge before entering back into the main city, but there's also a hidden shortcut here that requires a mushroom, which again helps make the gameplay a bit more interesting. From there, you're given the choice to either go left or right. The right path is pretty basic, but if you go left, you're given a glider ramp to fly over some stationary cars, which I think is cool. That's also the only way to get double items here, so we have another sort of speed versus items choice. All paths recombine on one last straightaway with some taxis before moving on to lap 2. The change here is small, but is one I do like, basically having us go right at the start to move backwards through the park. Again, not a huge change, but it's a cute thing to keep the track slightly more fresh. After coming out of the park, we even get the chance to trick on a manhole lid spewing out water before ending the lap the same way lap 1 ended. And then for our final lap, we start the same as 2, but instead of going through the park, we go straight under the bridge. This not only gives us a chance to take that shortcut that I mentioned before, but it also brings us to a new underground area. Now for me personally, this is probably my least favorite part of the track. It feels way too enclosed, and there's also not much here besides one big turn out of the garage. So overall, this track is decent. They generally did a good job avoiding long sections of nothing here besides maybe the end of lap 3. So I think for me, this can place up in B tier. I like Paris just a bit more, but this track is fine. Music wise, it's also probably my favorite so far. As for the second wave 2 track, we have Sydney Sprint, and I always remember really liking this one compared to the others. Something that helps with that is this track's usage of orange in some of the road, as it makes the track feel a bit more distinct. Don't worry though, if that was getting a bit too exciting, there's still plenty of normal gray road. Kicking off the race, we get to enter inside the Sydney Opera House. I take back my praise for the aesthetic. Like, I know other tracks also have this same 2D crowd, but on those other tracks, they are much farther away. Here, the illusion doesn't work at all because they're way too close. Well, luckily, we don't spend too long in there as we glide out and onto the road. Unfortunately, we do spend a decent amount of time here, but luckily, about halfway through, there are some ramps in the road that we need to avoid. I like that there are coins placed underneath the ramps to incentivize players to try and weave in and out of them. It makes the gameplay much more interesting. That's pretty much it for lap 1, as the rest is just a bunch of generic turns. Luckily, lap 2 picks up the pace by having us go through a completely different route. Instead of going into the Opera House to see those tortured souls again, we get to jump through a boat at the start, and a few turns later end up in Sydney's own little park. I actually like this quite a bit better than the one in New York, as there's a slanted road near each turn, which is faster than the main gray road, but harder to stay on without veering into the off-road. The off-road being here at all is also great because that opens up for plenty of shortcuts. This brings us back to the ramps from lap 1, but this time we're actually going the opposite direction, which allows us to go on top of them. I always like that we go backwards through these ramps to start with. It makes it feel much more rewarding when we do actually get the chance to go on these later. That brings us to another dirt area with plenty of off-road to cut through, but be warned, it is very easy to accidentally fly off of this instead. Speaking of flying, we're able to take a glider ramp and go backwards through the start to end off lap 2. That makes this final lap here basically just a backwards version of lap 1, which I think works fairly well. Yes, we do have a bit of boring road, but since we actually get to ride on top of the ramps this time, it feels much more manageable. We do also get to fly through the Opera House and I've also always liked how the very end has some off-road just to make for some any last second passes. So yeah, after going through this track again, I can confidently say that I'm still a fan. Maybe not as much as I was when it came out, but I'm still comfortable putting this up in A tier. It's got a decent amount of variety, and it mostly avoids the long boring roads. Not to mention that this also easily has the best song of the city tracks. It's an absolute banger. Now, wave 3 is really when the city toll started to hit me hard with London Loop. Aesthetically, I think this is the most boring of the cities with very little that truly stands out. Gameplay wise, I also don't think this one is very distinct. Like our beloved Tokyo Blur, this track also starts with a long stretch of fully enclosed road. There's nothing exciting for about 20 seconds, and even then, that exciting thing is just a fork in the road. If you want items, you go left, and if you want a faster but slightly harder route due to the buses, go right. This choice doesn't feel fun like in Paris because the fork is just so obvious and both routes just feel bland either way. Luckily, after the paths come together, we get to see something that sets this track apart from the rest. Chain chomps. I at least appreciate the obstacle being here to make this big turn more interesting. Obviously, if you want to go faster, you have to be closer to the grass, but that also means possibly getting too close to the chain chomp. This grass is also good for a massive shortcut, though it's quite hard to make it through with just one mushroom. Following that, there's a neat little drawbridge you can jump across, though half the time it's just flat, which always feels a bit anticlimactic. From there though, the boring and long enclosed road continues. There is a jump at one point, but that's hardly even worth noting, so we can just start lap 2. That brings us into a small park area. Starting to see a bit of a pattern. This one's different though because it's got a chain chomp. That does make cutting through this off-road a bit more difficult, I guess. After climbing up a few stairs, you guys aren't gonna believe it, but the rest of the lap is just road. Like, this seriously lasts for far longer than necessary, and it's the main reason I really do not like this track. Even with the addition of chain chomps, this is what most of the track boils down to, which is not interesting in the slightest. Lap 3 is also sadly not much better. I think the idea of having the chain chomps break loose on the last lap is cute, but they aren't even around most of the time. You've got one in the park, one around the fountain, and one around this patch of grass. It's pretty quick moving past them, and once you do, the long stretches of road just continue on. I especially dislike the ending here because after you go across the drawbridge again, you take a detour that leads to absolutely nothing but more boring road to artificially extend the length of this track. They could have ended this the same way lap 1 did, but instead they tried to make it longer, which just makes the track more boring. So yeah, unfortunately, I think this is a C tier. There's at least some things to like compared to Tokyo, but this is one of the biggest offenders of nothing track design. Song is also just okay. To end off wave 3, we got Berlin Byways, which is the city track that I've probably switched up on the most. While aesthetically it's not that notable, it's very obvious what the gimmick is, being cars. During gameplay, they'll act as obstacles that you need to avoid. I think just their presence does at least help the aesthetic by bringing the city to life, even if this is far from the only track to have cars in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Moonview Highway and especially Shroom Ridge use cars far better. Surprisingly though, this is the only tour city track to have these as obstacles, so that does help it stand out. That also does help with the long boring road problem, as there's always some obstacles driving around to avoid. Sadly though, that is very relevant on this track because a lot of it is just the road. We have a good 20 seconds of just avoiding some cars before we enter into a train station, which is a neat little addition. Personally though, I never go inside the train. It always feels a bit wonky getting out of it, and I think staying on the outside is just a lot safer. Outside the train station, there's this little split road, which isn't the most exciting thing, but I like the choice of a faster bottom path versus getting more coins on the higher end. For lap 2, we start by going off a glider ramp, which is a cool way to mix up the start, but sadly after that, we do have another long stretch of nothing but road. Like I said though, there are cars to avoid, which helps make this a little less boring than it could be, plus a few corners are made up of off-road. This stretch of road lasts for about 40 seconds before we finally reach a park area. Okay, it's really starting to lose its uniqueness. It doesn't even last that long here. There's one corner you can cut through the trees, and that's about it. I do kind of like this part of the road coming up though, as it overlaps with part of the track from earlier, which can lead you to crashing into other racers. Once you move under the thwomps, it's time for lap 3. This is the best lap because it has whomps coming out of the Berlin Wall. Somehow this is the only Mario Kart track in history to have whomps in it, and I actually think that is a pretty cute way to use the enemy. I really wish we went to this area on the other laps as well, honestly, because flying off the whomps is definitely the most fun part of the track. After that, there's the split road where you can either go through this tunnel or stay on the outside, which is not that interesting, but at least it breaks up the road a little bit. There's also a stair jump, which is kind of fun, but after that, the lap just ends the same way lap 2 did. So while there were some interesting ideas here, there was still a lot of road and another park section, which is getting quite repetitive. However, the inclusion of cars do definitely help, even if I'd rather play the other car maps before this. So I think in the end, this deserves a B tier. After seeing the other cities, my opinion on this has grown, but not enough to save it. Song is also solid here. Wave 4 is one of the special waves to get not 2, but 3 cities. To kick off this wave, we have Amsterdam Drift. Of the city tracks, this is probably the most forgettable for me. Not the worst, but at least Tokyo Blur is memorable for being awful. This track starts solid enough with a dip into a glider ramp. This takes us to a grassy area, which is not special for cities as we've seen, but at least there are some multi-moles here to make driving a bit more interesting. I do also like that some of the fences have holes cut into them, which let us cut through some off-road with a mushroom. But after jumping back through a boat, we get the grand return of boring road. But this time there's a trolley. It is so incredibly easy to avoid though that I basically forget it exists. Moving on to lap 2, this starts with us going underwater, and this is actually the only city track to do that. That would be cool, but unfortunately the water sections are incredibly boring. There is one cool bit where you can jump over a boat, but other than that, it's just more enclosed boring road, but underwater this time. That basically takes us all the way to the finish line where we can start lap 3 by moving past the trolley again. That's not really the interesting thing though, is we get to move back into the water, but this is kinda cool since we're going backwards, which means it's very likely to run into the other racers here. Luckily we don't spend too long in the water either, as we hop out of it into this large flower field. I do like how this mixes up the aesthetic, but I'm sorry, these flowers look so bad. Listen, I get the booster course tracks are lower quality, but every single one of these flowers just looks so fake. At least there are some piranha plants to stop you from getting too close, but since they're on the outer wall, they're kind of pointless since it's faster to just stick to the inner wall anyway. From there, we have a lot of really compact turns, which I've never really liked to reach the ending. They just feel super unnatural. Yeah, not a huge fan of this track. Sure, there are some unique elements, but gameplay-wise, there's just not much notable. The underwater sections barely feel special, so this is once again, sorry to say, a boring track. I'm putting this above London Loop in C tier. Song is nothing special either. Wow, I'm really starting to feel drained. Bangkok Rush, yay. Now that we're only halfway through, I really hope you guys are starting to understand why I'm not a fan of these. They are so samey and boring. I'm gonna try picking up the pace a bit because I really don't think I have a lot positive to say about this track. You start in this kinda cool water area where you can trick off boats, but don't be fooled. You only go through here once and the rest of the track is just standard city stuff. If I were to say the main thing that's supposed to set this track apart, it's the alternate paths, but I honestly find them so annoying to take most of the time that it's not even worth it. There's a market section where you can go on the roofs, but the ramp is kinda wonky, so I usually just stay on the floor. There's also several sections where you can go up a staircase over top of the boring road, but it's just more boring road up there. The staircases make it so awkward to reach that I just never bother. My brain is actually melting right now. I am so over talking about these tracks. There's eventually a glider ramp here, I guess, and that's pretty cool. After that, there's a bunch of dash panels past some sidesteppers. Why are they here? I like this building you can go up where you just hold drift for a long time. That's kind of fun. Jumping out onto the bouncy roofs is fun too. Yeah, that's the track. I'm just gonna put this in C tier. It's slightly better than London, I guess, but who cares? Music is actually kind of solid though. I'll give it that. Wave 4 isn't over though. Remember, we still got a third track.
I just can't do it. I can't.
Okay, you know what? Let's snap out of being sad because we got Singapore Speedway, and to most people, this is one of, if not the best city track. Right out of the gate, the aesthetic here is actually a lot more colorful than the other cities, giving this a bit of an upbeat party vibe. It's still a city at the end of the day, but it's one of the better ones to look at. Gameplay-wise, this ramps it up a bit too, with some decently exciting elements. We do start on a pretty long straightaway, which isn't the most exciting thing, but once we reach the end, we are shot out of a cannon onto the top of a roof party. This is such a cool inclusion, and it makes me really sad we only go here once the entire race, but it's always a good way to kick us off. We get one big turn here, which is very fun to do on top of the water before we have to jump back off the roof. We do so with a glider section that goes over a soccer stadium. Oh, football, sorry, I'm American. We don't actually have to go inside it, but it's a cool backdrop as we try to fly through some rings for extra speed. That's pretty much the end of lap 1, which I thought was a great start. Sadly though, lap 2 I'm really not as big a fan of. Instead of taking the cannon, we now go through a Chinatown section. Gameplay wise though, this just amounts to more enclosed road. There's like 2 booths you can weave between, but that's about it. I get the ideas to break up the aesthetic a bit, but honestly I was fine with the bright blue of the rest of the track. I do like that this section has a slightly different song as you drive through it though, that's pretty cool. The ending of this lap definitely makes it up to us though, as we get to fly through several sprouts of water, and I love the rainbow coloring these have on them. Like I said, the aesthetic on this one is great. Lap 3 surprisingly begins at a completely different location than the other two, where we get to ride across some conveyors. I always like when tracks add these in. They're small, but they really help sections stand out as you scramble to get to the one that'll actually help out. After leaving the conveyors, we get a bit of a blandish road before taking to the skies once more. This area is pretty neat because you have a lot of options here. I usually just keep flying while trying to hit the rings, but if you want, you can ride across the roof to get a ton of boost panels. Or if you really want to, you could just land immediately to get some items. I have never done this though, so I genuinely did not know there were Goomba towers here until making this video. From there we just go through more road sections from previous laps, but backwards this time to end off the track. Honestly, this one was pretty solid and I can certainly see the appeal. There were still quite a few spots with boring road, but for the most part this had some actual content. Add-on probably the best aesthetic of the bunch, and I'll put this up in A tier. Song is also pretty strong here, which was really important in the aesthetic being as good as it is. And you know what? Let's keep this positivity rolling with Athens Dash. This one has always stood out among the cities because of the fact that it both looks very different and I would argue plays very different. The biggest crime throughout this video was the sameness between the tracks, but I really do not feel that here. I mean, just look at this. Most of the track is made up of dirt roads with a lot of rundown buildings lining it. That makes Athens easily the most visually distinct of the bunch, which already helps it out a ton. But what makes it better is the fact that it doesn't fall into any of the gameplay pitfalls the other cities do. I mean, to start off this race, we are immediately faced with a massive jump, which even gives us different options on where to go. If you manage to land on this bit at the left, you even get a bit of a shortcut, but landing down at the bottom also gives you stuff to do with columns in the road to trick off. Then after circling this fountain, we get this really neat tilted turn on the circular area, which feels way different than just a standard curve. After we get off this, we then get the chance to take a small cut through some off-road before we're given a glider ramp through a small tunnel in the cliffside. Some swoopers even fly through here for some extra obstacles. And just to add even more to this turn, we got a half pipe, which I mean I would never take, but it's there. And that was just lap 1. Lap 2 begins with an even bigger jump, which again really sells the excitement of this track. No other city has us doing jumps like this. Sure, some have gliders, but the verticality here is really unmatched. This takes us backwards through the opening portion of lap 1, but then we get to go into this new area which sticks with the verticality theme I mentioned before by not only giving us a steep, but also massive staircase. This section has always really been cool. Not only are there Goombas to avoid as you rise up, but you have the option to either go left or right through a tiny entranceway, which is a cute way of splitting up the racers a bit. There's even a shortcut through the center as marked by the piranha plant cutouts. I actually really like this cut because it doesn't require a mushroom, as you can break these with shells as well, meaning even first place has a chance to take this if they want to risk using their item. I also appreciate how the stairs are broken up into several ramps so you can trick all the way up to the top. And that brings us to the end of lap 2, but even lap 3 has a ton of new stuff for us to see. We begin by immediately flying over a bunch of homes with another half pipe that no one will ever take. We then have a few small pillars to weave between before getting into the cliffside portion of this track. Here we have to avoid boulders as we also have to try and hit dash panels for extra speed. Always love when tracks do this, as it feels incredibly satisfying to just barely sneak past a boulder to hit that boost. There's even a hidden shortcut through the cliffside just in case the boulders are a bit scary. Guess you can't outrun them all. After reaching the top, we get put back into the staircase section for the ending. Yeah, I think I've made it pretty clear that this is my favorite city track, and that's because not once did I mention there being a single dull moment here. There is always something going on, whether it be obstacles to avoid or big jumps to make. Add on that the aesthetic is so different from all the other cities, and this track really does feel like it could stand alone. So for having basically nothing for me to truly complain about, this is an easy S tier. I guess the song isn't my favorite of the bunch, but I do still think it's solid enough. Wait, I forgot I'm supposed to be hating. It's time for Los Angeles laps. Despite there being a decent variety of locations in this one, I don't know, I've never really enjoyed it. We start by jumping off a boardwalk and down onto the beach. A beach setting is unique amongst the city tracks, which is nice, but we really don't spend too long here. It's fun to dodge some sidesteppers and dip into the water while we are here, but this only makes up a small portion of the track. There's also a bit of a skate park on the beach with several ramps and even a half pipe, which helps the beach feel a little less bland. Unfortunately though, nothing could save the actual city portion. The second we leave the beach, this track takes a severe nosedive. We have this long stretch of road that you just drive straight on for a prolonged period of time. Eventually some turns get thrown in, but that straightaway was far too long with absolutely nothing on it. After a bit, we do get the chance to glide over a baseball stadium, which I guess is kinda neat, although it makes me very sad we haven't gotten a new Mario Sluggers game. Unfortunately, my sadness continues after we land because it's time for some more boring road. There's like one shortcut you could take right at the start, but aside from that, you're stuck in an enclosed area for quite a while. There are a few jumps that make this slightly less boring, but it's not that special. Although this ramp has always bothered me, why is it 2 boost panels instead of just one big one? This track is ruined! That brings us into lap 3 where we enter this oil field. This is a pretty unique setting for a city track, and I like that there are several different routes to take here. The machines act as pretty good obstacles, and there's even a glider shortcut you can take if you have a mushroom. And then after that, it's a big stretch of road to the end. So yeah, there is some unique stuff here, but at the end of the day, a lot of this track is just road. While setting-wise this may be more unique than New York Minute, at least that track is more dense with content. LA Laps here stretches everything out and just makes this feel tedious to go through. So for me, this is a C tier. Top of the C tier so far, but it's still not great. I'd say the song is at least above average for these cities. But Wave 5 was also a triple whammy, as we've still got to talk about Vancouver Velocity. Now before this one released, everyone was hyping it up as potentially the best city track of the bunch. So after it released, did I agree with that? We start this track by immediately jumping out of the city and into a park area. Now yes, parks have been a bit overdone, but Vancouver's is unique enough to where it doesn't matter. Not only is it snowy to mix up the aesthetic, but this has us going across several thin bridges. Not only is this good for keeping us close together, but we also get to see the only real use of anti-gravity in any of these city tracks. The half pipes actually use anti-gravity. Due to how lacking the booster course pass was with anti-gravity as a whole, this was a greatly appreciated inclusion. Too bad we go here once and the rest of the track is boring. At the end of the bridge, we reach a glider ramp to bring us back to the city. There's a shortcut we can take here, but after that, we're sticking to the road until lap 2. Instead of heading over to the snowy park this time, we now have to jump across this dock into a more normal park. I guess this sort of gives off fall vibes, but it doesn't really feel that special. Especially gameplay-wise, because for most of this, you're stuck in a fence, meaning there's no interesting cuts to be made here. I guess the fence does open up in case you want to go for a swim, but like, why would you do that? Eventually, we reach a glider ramp to take us into an ice rink. I think this is a cute little set piece as we get to avoid some shy guys. It doesn't last too long, but I appreciate the inclusion. But here's where the track really takes a hit for me. Jumping out of the arena, we've got a long stretch of nothing leading into and past lap 3. There is a tunnel, I guess, but that's barely even worth noting. And once we're out of the tunnel, we're back to the ice rink to end off the track the same way lap 2 ended. So yeah, I really don't think this is the best city. I think people saw this had anti-gravity potential and just fixated on that without considering how little of the track that actually makes up. This did have a decent amount of unique locations though, and I don't think it was as stretched out as LA, so I'll give it B tier. The song is also decent, but nothing really notable. We have finally made it to the last wave, and luckily this only has 2 cities. We're starting off with Rome Avanti, and when this came out, I was overall fairly positive about it. We can see why pretty much immediately as we enter into this track's highlight, the Colosseum. This is very different from anything else the other city tracks offer, and it's pretty fun to climb to the top of this, especially jumping off this ramp. Unfortunately though, we don't spend too long here before jumping back into the main city. Luckily though, it's kept interesting with a few additions like this neat shortcut immediately after the jump, a circular turn around a statue, and another turn with a cut after it. This brings us to a straightaway, but instead of leaving it just blank like most cities, Rome Avanti actually adds some rocky wrenches here that we can try and trick on. That significantly improves this area, and fun fact, this is the only track in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe to have rocky wrenches.
Why?
After that, lap 1 comes to an end, and sadly lap 2 is a bit of a drag. We stay pretty much just on an enclosed road for a good portion of this lap. It's kinda cool how we cross over a part of the track where we can maybe see the racers in the back, but since we're going in a similar direction, it's a lot less exciting than the collisions in Amsterdam, for example. I do kinda like the staircase portion that breaks up the road, as it's fun to try and get speed from tricking while also staying straight on the course. Once we get to the top, we're given a park section! This is nothing more than a pretty basic enclosed turn though, but at least we get some excitement jumping back onto the track and going against the racers in the back. That brings us to the end of lap 2, and lap 3 begins with a glider over some water. That eventually brings us back into the Colosseum, but this time we stay on the ground level. I really like this part as we have to try and avoid the chain chomps biting into the road, however the bits around the broken road can actually act as ramps to trick on. So this is a big risk and reward scenario where you can try and trick off the ramps for extra speed, but risk getting chomped in the process. That definitely helps this portion of the track stand out. From here we just have a bit of a repeat of lap 1, but the ending stretch now is a glider ramp in case we want to say hi to some fuzzies. So overall, I think this track is decent. I do wish we got to spend more time in the Colosseum, but I still had a solid time here. Lap 2 was sadly a bit of a drag, but I think Rome still earned itself a B tier. The song is just kind of okay though. But we have at long last made it to the final city track. Let's see if Madrid Drive ends us off with a bang. Well, I could certainly say it doesn't start us off with a bang because we got a pretty long stretch of enclosed road. After like 20 seconds of that, we jump into this pretty open area with a wiggler. This isn't really that exciting though, but I guess the wiggler is cute. After that, we get to enter into a few buildings. First is a greenhouse, which at the very least is more interesting than the parks. There's a small off-road cut here and even some piranha plants, but again they're on the outer wall so they hardly matter. After that, we get to enter into an art museum, and I've always liked this part. Not only does the song change to match it, but all of the art hanging on the wall looks great here. I've always liked this art style from the Mario series, so seeing a bunch of different pictures with it is great.
But be careful, one of these paintings aren't like the others.
Well, that's basically the end of lap 1, and lap 2 just gives us more boring road. Luckily, this is a bit shorter than the first lap as we eventually have to dodge some thwomps before we enter into the wiggler area. This time though, the wiggler is awake.
Ooh, it's so hard to dodge, ooh.
After that, we get the legally required park section of the track, but I do like the glider ramp and water sprouts thrown in here as it makes it a bit more interesting. After a big turn with an off-road cut, we are able to jump back into the city to end off lap 2. Just like the other two, lap 3 starts with some more road. This time though, it's by far the longest stretch without anything interesting. After like 20 seconds, we do get a couple Goombas and an off-road cut, but then it's just back to the road. At the very least, at the end of this, we get to enter inside a soccer stadium, which is a great set piece as we have to avoid soccer balls being kicked by Goombas and Goomba shoes. Like the art museum, the song here also changes to match the setting. I kinda wish we got to spend longer in here though, because after 5 seconds, we're just back on the road to reach the end of the course. So yeah, sadly, I can't say this was much of a bang to end on. This had a ton of enclosed road sections, so while there were some cool highlights, they definitely made up a minority of the track. I'm gonna have to sadly end us off with a C tier. At least this time around, the song is really good. But yeah, that's the end of our tier list, and man, this was a lot longer than I was expecting it to be. But I think it was important to go through every track to really show what makes a city so underwhelming. A majority of them not only have a very similar aesthetic, but also long portions dedicated to just driving in an enclosed space. Sure, other Mario Kart tracks have that too, but at least their aesthetic is unique enough to carry those portions. That's just not the case for the cities, so those long and empty road segments just feel like a drag. They're also much worse here compared to other Mario Kart tracks because these cities have to stay accurate to their real world counterparts. The best moments in these tracks are really when they lean heavily on the Mario Kart mechanics rather than being realistic depictions of the city, whether it be the glider sections in Singapore or the anti-gravity in Vancouver Velocity. In Mario Kart, realism isn't the most interesting thing, and when it gets repeated over and over again, it gets extra tiring. Every time one of these tracks would release, it felt more and more like,
I played these games before!
So while yes, there were a few standout cities, I think it's clear that they were overall just far too repetitive. But anyways, that's it for this video. Do you think Neo Bowser City should have been included here and you hate me for not mentioning it? Let me know in the comments. This video turned out to be way longer than I was expecting it to be. Honestly, I was hoping Nintendo was going to announce the Switch 2 by now so I could make a video about that, but instead I had to cram all this editing into a couple days, so I really appreciate that. Thanks, Nintendo. But before I go, I've got to make sure to thank my members, being Shrugface Wyatt Derpy, Caddy Shroom, Andres Valerio, Mikey Fuller, Maidzo2, Ryan, Miss Jades a lot, I'm Not Denny BG, Gnarled, Yanni the Duck, SMA, B Major 2003, Arson the Raboot, Sir Musty, Kid Trunks 15, Balandor, Puggles Are Fun, Trader Mo, Diluted Colors, Cinder CC, Jade Avery, Prunzel Clone, Thicky Reiki, SJ100, Ungenio TM, CW McCain, Tibby, JubeTube Z, Tesseract Nuclear, Mr. McMahon 5702, Sebi, Hippopotamus, Jameson Pageson, Wilbur, Golden Sandslash 15, Zfrost, Stuffy Ant, Justex, Conkanut, Keep, and Christian Flattery Sequel Edition. But anyways, dry bones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.